Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive, ZFS on RAID. That's what we're tackling today, which I know a bunch of you have been super curious about.
Yeah, tons of questions come in about this one.
We've got a really interesting mix of articles and forum threads you guys sent us. Thanks for those, by the way. Some of them are super in-depth and technical, and then others are, straight from the front lines, real-world stuff.
Love that. That means we're hitting on something that people are actually grappling with out there in the wild.
Totally. And the overall feeling I get is, well, let's just say I haven't exactly sensed universal love for this whole ZFS on RAID idea, right?
That's putting it mildly. Ha ha.
Mm.
You see, ZFS already has this kind of, I don't know, mystique about it. It's famous for being this incredibly powerful, but also kind of intimidating file system.
Oh, yeah? So when people start talking about, like, layering it on top of hardware RAID, which, let's be real, that can seem pretty complex in its own right. Well, let's just say a little healthy skepticism is totally understandable.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, at first, I was right there with them, skeptical as can be. I mean, if ZFS is supposed to be this, like, self-sufficient data integrity guru, why on earth would we complicate things with RAID? It felt a little bit like, showing up to a gunfight with a knife.
I totally get where you're coming from. It's a super common concern, and honestly, in some situations, just going straight ZFS is the smarter move. Especially if you've got a really beefy system, tons of resources to throw around, you might not need RAID at all.
So true.
But, and this is where things get really interesting, hardware RAID isn't just about redundancy, right? Like, it can seriously boost performance, especially
Yeah.
in specific scenarios.
Oh, now you've got my attention. Hit me with those scenarios. What are we talking about here?
Picture this, database servers.
Hmm.
Or even better, imagine these huge virtualized environments where you've got read-write operations happening constantly nonstop.
Makes sense.
In those situations, a dedicated hardware RAID controller, that's your key. It can take a massive load off your main system just by handling all those disk operations crazy fast.
So it's like having a pit crew, for your data, just making sure everything's running smoothly behind the scenes.
Exactly. And that frees up ZFS to do what it's best at. Those high-level data integrity checks, snapshots, all that cool stuff that makes it so powerful.
Gotcha. So it's more about teamwork than straight redundancy in those cases.
100%.
But, okay, let's dive into this whole data integrity wizard thing for a sec, because one of the articles you sent, I think it was that ZFS on RAID debunking the myths one, brought up this point that's been bugging me ever since I read it. They basically said that, get this, running ZFS on top of RAID actually increases your risk of losing data.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Which just seems insane, doesn't it? Like, adding this whole extra layer of supposed protection somehow makes things less safe.
It's a really common misconception,
Yeah.
and I totally get why people get tripped up by it.
It's counterintuitive.
It is.
Well-
I think it really comes down to the way that ZFS actually, handles the disks themselves.
Yeah.
So when you're running ZFS on its own, it's got this, beautiful direct connection to those physical disks. And that's what lets it really flex its muscles in terms of data protection.
Control, ultimate power, right?
Right. But then, when you toss a RAID controller into the mix, suddenly ZFS is working with this pre-configured array. It's not, talking directly to those individual disks anymore.
I see.
So, totally naturally, people are going to wonder, hold on, if ZFS can't even see those disks directly, how's it supposed to keep my data safe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, what happens to those legendary ZFS checksums everyone's always raving about? Are they useless now?
Not even close. And this is where that safety net analogy comes in really handy.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Think of hardware RAID as, your primary safety line, right?
Yeah.
It's there to catch you if one of your disks decides to, I don't know, go on vacation or something.
I like it. So RAID's got our back, literally.
Exactly. But what if there's a silent error, something sneaky, some corruption that RAID just doesn't pick up right away? That's where our friend ZFS comes in to save the day.
Okay.
Even though it's not micromanaging the disks at that point, it's still diligently writing those checksums, like digital fingerprints, for every single block of data you've got. So if something goes sideways, even if RAID misses it completely, ZFS is going to be the one to sound the alarm.
So it's like a backup safety net, just in case that first one fails. I like it. Double the protection.
Precisely. ZFS is constantly monitoring the integrity of your data, even at the bit level. It doesn't matter what's going on with those physical disks underneath.
Yeah.
It's about adding another layer of defense. not replacing one with the other.
Okay, phew, that's a relief to hear. But, okay, if those checksums are still doing their thing and we've got RAID handling the hardware side of things, it kind of makes you wonder, isn't ZFS on RAID a little, well, redundant? I mean, ZFS has its own RAID-like features with RAIDs and all that, so why even bother with a separate RAID card in the first place? Wouldn't it be way simpler, and maybe even faster, to just let ZFS be in charge of everything?
That is a very, very sharp observation.
Yeah.
And honestly, it gets to the core of this whole debate. There are definitely times when going full ZFS using RAIDs instead of a hardware RAID controller makes total sense. Like, in fact, that ZFS on top of RAID, is it okay article you sent, they make a really strong argument for that approach, especially if your system's got power to spare.
Right. They definitely seem to favor straight ZFS if you can swing it.
And for good reason, it can be super efficient. But here's the thing. ZFS, for all its awesomeness, can be a bit of a resource hog, especially those RAID calculations. If you're not careful, they can really bog down your CPU.
Ah, okay. So if you're working with a system that's, let's say, a little more budget conscious, throwing all those RAID tasks at ZFS might not be the best idea.
You got it. That's when a nice hardware RAID controller really shines. It's like having a dedicated assistant whose whole job is just to manage those disks, make sure they're redundant, and that frees up your main system to, focus on other things.
All about delegation.
Exactly. And this could be a huge win for performance, especially for those resource-limited situations we were talking about before.
Right, those database servers, virtualized environments, all those places where every little bit of performance matters. So it's not that one approach is inherently better. It's about figuring out which setup actually fits your needs and what you've got available to work with. I'm starting to see the big picture here. But there's still this, nagging doubt.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
This idea that by using ZFS on top of RAID, you're somehow limiting it, holding it back. That you're missing out on some of that ZFS magic by not letting it have total control of the disks.
The neutered ZFS myth. Oh, we hear that one all the time.
Really?
All the time. And it makes sense. People worry that they're going to lose out on those amazing ZFS features if they don't let it run the show completely.
I know, I was having a mini panic attack about it earlier.
But I promise you that is not the case at all.
Okay, good, because I was about to have a full-blown meltdown.
Yeah.
But what about, snapshots? And compression, deduplication, all that good stuff that makes ZFS so special, those are still on the table with ZFS on RAID, right?
Absolutely.
Rawr.
And this is so important. I can't stress it enough. Using ZFS on top of a RAID setup does not mean you're giving up any of that core ZFS functionality, I promise.
Yeah.
It's like, imagine you've got one of those awesome multi-tools, right?
Sure, yeah.
Just because you happen to be using the screwdriver right now instead of, I don't know, the pliers, doesn't mean that the other tools have suddenly disappeared, right?
Yep.
They're still there, ready to go.
Right. It's the same awesome multi-tool, just arranged a little differently. So to be crystal clear, even if I go with ZFS on RAID, I can still use snapshots, compression to save space, deduplication, all of it.
Every single bit. Those features are baked into the very core of ZFS. They work at a level that's above those physical disks. So whether those disks are being managed by a RAID controller or by ZFS directly, it doesn't matter. The magic still happens.
That is seriously good to know. I think there's this misconception floating around that you're somehow getting this elite version of ZFS when you use it with RAID, which is totally not true at all.
Not true.
Okay, good to know. But, okay, let's address the elephant in the room here, which is complexity. Because let's be honest, ZFS has this little bit of a reputation for being, shall we say, feature-rich, which can be a little intimidating for people who are just getting started, right?
Oh, for sure.
So is it crazy to think that tossing RAID into this mix just makes things exponentially more complicated?
It's a totally valid concern. There's no doubt about it. ZFS has a learning curve. There's no getting around that.
It does.
But here's what's interesting. Sometimes using ZFS on top of RAID can actually make things simpler, especially when it comes to managing everything.
Wait, hold on. Are you telling me that adding another layer of technology can actually make my life easier? How does that even work?
Okay, think of it like this. When you're running ZFS solo, you're the one in charge of setting up and managing every single little detail of your storage pool. From redundancy to performance optimization, it's all on you.
It's a lot.
It is. But when you bring in a hardware RAID controller, you're basically offloading a lot of those tasks to that dedicated piece of hardware. It's like having an experienced IT pro on call who just takes care of all those little details for you, so you can focus on the big picture.
So instead of being intimidated by this massive wall of ZFS configuration options, I can let the RAID card do the heavy lifting and just enjoy the ride. That almost sounds too good to be true. But what about performance? I mean, we know that ZFS is designed to work directly with those disks. So wouldn't sticking a RAID card in there create some kind of bottleneck? Like, is there a performance hit that we need to be aware of?
That is such a good question, and it comes up a lot, and it's totally valid to think about. In a perfect world, yeah, ZFS would have total control over the disk so it could optimize every little thing for speed.
Right, of course.
However, even when it's working on top of RAID, ZFS can still be crazy fast. And, get this, in some cases, it might even be faster with RAID. Remember that whole dedicated assistant idea we talked about before?
A hardware RAID card, right?
Yeah. Bingo. By offloading those RAID processing tasks, you're actually freeing up precious system resources. You're giving your CPU a chance to, breathe a little.
I see. So it's not working harder, it's working smarter.
Exactly. And that can really boost overall performance, especially in those resource-limited setups. It's like, carpooling to work. Sure, you could drive by yourself, but sharing the ride can be a lot faster and more efficient, especially if you hit traffic.
Okay, that's a great analogy. I'm seeing the light here. It's not always a simple case of ZFS is inherently faster with direct access. It's way more nuanced than that. Sometimes that combo of ZFS and hardware RAID can actually give you better performance if you set it up right. It's all about finding that sweet spot where they work together.
You got it.
But, okay, before we get too comfy with this whole ZFS on RAID thing, we've got to address another big one that keeps popping up. And that's this fear that, ZFS's advanced features get nerfed when you pair it with RAID. Are we giving up some of ZFS's power by not letting it control those disks directly?
Oh, the limited edition ZFS myth. This is another one we hear so often, and it's really a shame because it stops people from trying setups that could be awesome for them.
It's like being too scared to try a delicious new dish just because it looks a little different from what you're used to.
Exactly. And in this case, you'd be missing out on a fantastic meal. So, to clear this up once and for all, using ZFS on a RAID setup does not mean you lose any access to those advanced ZFS features. Period. End of story.
Seriously.
Right.
No, caveats, no fine print I need to read.
None whatsoever. It's like saying you can't use your phone's camera anymore just because you connected to Wi-Fi. Those features are just built into ZFS no matter how your storage is set up underneath.
Wait, really? So I still get to use all the cool stuff? Snapshots, deduplication, compression, the whole shebang?
All of it. You can still take snapshots like crazy, compress your data down to the size of a pea, deduplicate like there's no tomorrow, and you can do it all while enjoying the perks of your hardware RAID controller. It's the best of both worlds.
That's amazing. Okay, last but not least, let's tackle this whole idea that ZFS and hardware RAID are oil and water, totally incompatible. I saw this pop up on a few forums, and it honestly makes me a little nervous.
Ugh, the implacable enemies myth. I promise it's nothing but a tall tale. While it's true that ZFS is designed with direct disk control in mind, it's not like it's this inflexible, rigid system that throws a fit if it sees a RAID controller.
So they can actually get along, like two professionals sharing a workspace.
Precisely. Think of ZFS like a super skilled craftsperson who can adapt their techniques to different tools and materials. Yeah, ZFS might prefer to have complete control over every single step, but it gets that there are times when collaborating with a specialist, like a RAID controller, is just the most efficient way to go.
Okay, that makes me feel a lot better. So we've busted some major myths today. ZFS on RAID doesn't make your data less safe, it's not inherently redundant, and it definitely doesn't rip away any of ZFS's powers.
Nope.
In fact, it can actually make things faster in certain setups. Who knew?
It's true. The big takeaway here is that picking between running ZFS on its own or putting it on top of a RAID array, it's not about finding that one right answer for everyone. It's about understanding how each approach works, what it's good at, and then making a smart decision based on what you need, what your priorities are, and what you've got to work with.
And that, my friends, is what these deep dives are all about. But we're just getting warmed up. We've got a lot more ground to cover, so stick around as we explore some real-world situations where ZFS on RAID really shines. And trust me, there are some good ones.